Okay, so I'm doing this one more for myself than anything else, so I completely apologize. This will probably be a long video because this is something I'm very weak at. All right, so I'm going to go over CA3 Intro to the Nervous System. In this lecture, the main topics that I thought he focused on were the general overall organization of the nervous system, so talking about how physically the neurons are arranged. Then he breaks it down and focuses on the autonomic nervous system as opposed to the somatic nervous system. So, talking about what we can control versus what we can't consciously control. And then he further breaks that down and looks at the visceral and somatic branches. So, there's this focus on visceral and somatic of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay. So I'm gonna get started. Again, this is not gonna be a smooth video. All right, so first of all, we know that axons, which are the cells of the nervous system, they have cell bodies, they have dendrites that receive information, and then they have these long tail-like projections, which are called axons. But in order to speed up the rate of transmission of signals, the axons are going to be wrapped around in this insulating substance called myelin. It's a myelin, it's like a fatty sheath with these little gaps in between called nodes of Ranvier, and they allow for saltatory conduction or whatever of the signal. So the myelin is going to be made in the peripheral nervous system. It's made from Schwann cells, by Schwann cells, and in the central nervous system, it's made of by oligodendrocytes. But either way, we have the axons, they're wrapped in the myelin. So you can think of these kind of like electrical cables. So you know how there's like the wire inside, and then there's like an insulating fabric, and then you can group a bunch of those wires together and make a thicker wire, and then you insulate those and then group those together and so on. That's the kind of idea here, where we take the individual axons and we pack them together into a group of axons. It's kind of like a bundle of sticks, and we call that group of axons grouped together a fascicle. Okay, so fascicles are groups of these axons stuck together. And then we wrap those fascicles, just like the axon is wrapped in a Schwann cell, we wrap it in a layer that's called the peri meaning around, neurium. So it's around the neuron. And then we group those fascicles in their perineuriums together. There's blood supply inside. And when you group those fascicles together, we wrap them in another coat, and that's called the epineurium. Think of like the epidermis. And there's going to be further blood supply and so on in that epineurium. But now that we have all of this together wrapped in the epineurium, that's what's going to be considered a nerve or a tract, depending on whether or not we're in the CNS or the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so that is the general how we make up nerves. And for the spinal cord, we need to know the general structure. So again, we talked about the fact that there's the bulge up top, the cervical enlargement. There's the bulge down at the bottom, the conus medullaris. There's the little tails coming off, which contain the sacral spinal nerves or whatever. And that's called the cauda equina. And then the final piece of the pia mater that tethers it to the sacrum, which is called the filum terminale. The other thing you need to know is the number of nerves in each section. So there are 8 cervical nerves, even though there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. That's because C1 enters at the top. So C1 goes on top of, it's in between the C1 vertebrae and the skull. Then C2 is over C2 and so on, and that happens all the way down to C7. But what's unique about C7 is that C7 nerve root is above the C7 vertebrae and C8 is below it. So that's why there are 8. And then after we exit out of the cervical region, all of the thoracic, lumbar, and sacral ones are going to come out under their respective vertebrae. Okay, so that's the general organization of the central nerve of the nervous system. Okay, and we know again, central is going to be everything inside the brain and spinal cord, and peripheral is going to be everything outside. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit confusing for me, especially. So when we look, if we like cut the spinal cord and we're looking down at a cut piece of it, coming off of each side, so there's the front side, which is the ventral side, and the back side, which is the dorsal side, there's going to be a dorsal, right? That's over here, I think. And nope, this is ventral. There's a ventral side and a dorsal side. And the ventral side has it has little rootlets, so tiny little rootlets, and those collect to form the ventral root. And the same thing happens at the dorsal end, where it has a bunch of little rootlets and they come together to form the dorsal root. So the dorsal's in the back, ventral's in the front. And then those two roots come together to form the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve is made up of the combination of those two roots, if that makes sense. And why this is important is that sensory versus motor information is transmitted through different parts of that spinal cord. And this is something I always got confused with. So the big picture here is that the dorsal is going to have so the dorsal being the back is going to be sensory, and motor is going to be in the front. And the way I remember this is with the expression keep moving forward. So moving is for movement and forward is for the front of that vertebral column. So keep moving forward reminds me that the ventral nerve root is going to contain the motor, and then I always feel like there's something on my back, or I feel like I got to get this off my back, to remember that the sensory is coming out of the dorsal one. So ventral is motor, keep moving forward. Dorsal is sensory. I feel like there's something I got to get off my back. But the very important thing to remember is while these two roots are separate, the spinal nerve itself is a combination of both. So the sensory and the motor come together, and the spinal nerve itself is a mixed nerve. That is very important. It comes up again and again and again. Okay, so that's one way they're different. So one way motor versus sensory is different is that motor is from the front. I've said this too many times. Sensory is in the back. The other way that they're different is that the motor cell bodies are located inside the spinal cord itself in the central nervous system, whereas the sensory bodies are going to be in the dorsal root ganglia. So dorsal being the back, root ganglia. So there's no ventral root ganglia, that doesn't exist. So I remember dorsal root ganglia, that is so dorsal root, keep moving forward, that has to be about movement. Dorsal root ganglia, it's about movement. Okay, so that's the first piece of organization. Next, he goes on to divide the nervous system into two main branches. The one that we control consciously, which is the somatic being like of the body, and the one that we don't control consciously, which is the autonomic. So autonomic is automatic is how I remember that. But when you look at the autonomic nervous system, you can further break that down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, where sympathetic, as you know, is rest and digest, and parasympathetic is, oh my goodness, sympathetic is fight or flight, and parasympathetic is rest and digest. Okay, so those are the two components of the, oh my goodness, the autonomic nervous system. Both of these, though, rely on something called the two-cell model. And what the two-cell model means is that there's no one axon that goes from the first cell body to the target organ. But instead, the cell body, the original cell 1, is going to send out a pre-ganglionic fiber, so an axon before the ganglion, where the ganglion is a collection of cells in the peripheral nervous system. And it's going to send out a ganglion that's going to, send out an axon that's going to synapse with the ganglion. And this is true in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So we have one cell, the main cell, the cell nucleus for whatever it is. It sends out an axon, a pre-ganglionic fiber. to the ganglion. And then the ganglion is going to send out another fiber, and that is the postganglionic neuron, or the postganglionic nerve, and that is going to go to the target organ. Okay, so both sympathetic and parasympathetic have this two model system. What's different between the two is one, where within the spinal cord or within the brain are these cell ones, right, the original cell, and where within the body are the ganglia. Those are the two main ways that the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous systems vary. So for the sympathetic nervous system, we have something called the sympathetic chain, and that is going to be found along basically in the thoracic region. So it's found between T1 and L2 of, I'm sorry, I was wrong. The sympathetic chain is the cell 2. I'm sorry. This is found actually inside the spinal cord. So between T1 and L2 of the spinal cord, actually in the spinal cord, in the lateral horn, that's where you're going to find cell 1, the cell 1 that sends out the preganglionic fibers. And it's going to send out those preganglionic fibers very close to that region. So if it's like T1, there's going to be that sympathetic chain I was talking about. That's going to be right next to the spinal cord. It's on either side of it. And that contains the ganglia that's going to send out the neuron that actually goes to the target organ. So in the sympathetic one, it sends out a little ganglia very close to the spinal cord. That's where the sympathetic chain is. Then there'll be another it'll synapse with the ganglia, and then the ganglia will send out its second one. I'm sorry, I know this is confusing, but it's because I'm thinking it through. Okay, so that's the sympathetic nervous system. That's your fight or flight. How this is different from the parasympathetic. So parasympathetic is the same in that it has the two-cell system. However, it's different in where we're going to see those first cells and the location of the parasympathetic ganglia. So where do we see cell 1 for parasympathetic? It's going to be in the brainstem itself, and we'll talk about the different parts of it that have it when we talk about spinal nerves. And then skip the whole thoracic part, right? Because that's where the sympathetic stuff is. And then we go to the S2 to S4 of the spinal cord. So it's in the brainstem, skip everything else, and then S2 to S4 of the spinal cord. That's where we're going to see the parasympathetic cell 1s, the preganglionic neurons. The ganglia themselves, instead of being like the sympathetic ones, which were right on the other side of the nervous system in the sympathetic chain, they're actually located near the organs that they innervate. So, for example, if we're talking about like innervating your salivary glands, the ganglia for that is going to be very close to the salivary gland that it innervates. So it's going to send out a cord. It's going to send out that long fiber. Sometimes it hitches a ride on other fibers, and it goes all the way to near the organ. That's where the ganglia is going to be. And then it's going to send out another little short postganglionic neuron to the target organ. I hope that makes sense. The big difference is where the cell 1 is located, okay, and where the ganglia are located. That's the difference between the two of them. Okay, so this is showing the same kind of another diagram of this. So we can see the dorsal rootlets. Remember, dorsal is sensory. I feel like there's something on my back. Ventral is motor. They come together. We have the dorsal root ganglia, which are right next to for motor. And then those are going to come together to form the spinal nerve, which is mixed. The next thing that we have to know is these two pieces that allow for the exchange of information between the peripheral nervous system and the sympathetic chain ganglia. So remember the sympathetic chain, that's going to be between that T1 and T1 and L2 of the spinal cord. And here's the little ganglia that's very close to it, right? Unlike the other ones, unlike the parasympathetic, which are far away, these are right near the vertebrae. and they can exchange information using what's called the gray ramus communicans and the white ramus communicans. And I always mix this one up, so I'm just going to double check it as I say it. So the white ramus communicans is going to take sympathetic information from the ventral roots to the sympathetic ganglia. So it's taking information from the roots to the sympathetic ganglia. Okay, so going from the roots to the ganglia. And the gray one, the gray ramus communicans, goes the other way. It takes the information from the ganglia to the roots. Okay, so it's the communicans, the white and gray, allow for the exchange of information between the rootlets, the ventral ramus, and the sympathetic chain. Okay, so that's what that is. Something I've always been very confused about. Okay, so the clinical correlation that he talks about in this lecture, because it was kind of a lot, are what would happen when we have lesions to different parts of the spinal cord. So we talked about the fact that the dorsal has sensory, like pain. I'm sorry, has, oh goodness, the dorsal has stuff that you feel, right? Whereas the ventral is motor. So it makes sense that a lesion to the dorsal horn could affect sensation. So if we have, for example, damage to the pain receptors in the dorsal horn, we can see amplification of pain. If we have lesions to temperature, the temperature center, we can have difficulty sensing temperature. Okay, that's going to go along with lesions to that sensory area, the dorsal horn. The lateral horn has the the preganglionic sympathetic neurons. Okay, so we'll get to that later. But the ventral horn has the motor stuff, because remember, keep moving forward. And so a lesion here is going to affect motor stuff. And you can think of like all the bad disorders that mess with your reflexes or your ability to control yourself, like causing paralysis, floppy paralysis that's flaccid, cramping, or like polio and ALS. So ventral lesions are gonna affect your movement, whereas dorsal lesions are going to affect pain. Okay, I know this has been going on for forever, but the last thing that he focuses on is the difference between visceral and somatic, afferents and efferents. So when I think afferents, I think, how is this going to affect me? And when I think efferents, I think of the effort it takes to do something. Because afferents is about sensory information that's coming in and you're trying to decide how that affects you. When you see the word visceral, that's talking about your organs. So when we're looking at visceral afferents, putting those together, we're talking about sensations from, for example, your GI system. And so I remember at visceral afferents, how is this stomach ache going to affect me? So how does this affect me? I'm taking in this information, and what makes it visceral is that it's coming from the organs, which means that we don't consciously perceive it. In contrast, visceral efferents, okay, so still having to do with the organs, so it's not voluntary. I think it takes a lot of effort to digest your food, because efferent takes effort. Okay, so this is actions, they're like motor things, but we're not doing it consciously. This is different from somatic afferents and efferents. So it's still, how is this going to affect me? And it takes a lot of effort. But somatic, these are going to be conscious. So this is like touch, pain, and then your special senses. So those are going to be your somatic afferents. And your somatic efferents, it takes effort. Those are going to be like movements. Okay, so, moving your skeletal muscles and stuff like that. Okay, so he talks about somatic and visceral, afferents and efferents. That's another topic that we talk about today. And the clinical correlation to this is referred pain. So for referred pain, the classic example is a heart attack and how people feel the pain in their left shoulder. And the biological underpinning of this is that there's crosstalk between the visceral, which are the unconscious afferents, remember how is this going to affect me, and the somatic, which are the conscious afferents. And he describes this as being a conscious awareness of unconscious pain. And it has to do with their locations, with the dermatome and all that stuff. He goes into more detail, but big picture, you need to know that referred pain is because of this crosstalk between this unconscious visceral and the conscious somatic afferent signals. Okay, I hope this made sense.